to have a nice strong connection between the bottom of the pulpit and the base, I've glued together 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood, and I'll trim this with a plane so that it'll fit just perfectly in here. And then I'll put a couple of screws on each side here, which will be covered later on with trim. Try to do the same thing up forward, and then some screws through the front piece, which will be covered by the carving, the CNC carving that's going to be applied here. And that ought to, and then of course it'll get glued in there as well. And that ought to make it really strong, so then I can put some screws and glue straight on down through here into the base, and it'll hold it really well, because you know people are going to try to pick this thing up by the top, and I want it to be really, really strong for that, and for any racking, you know, when you lean on the pulpit while you're speaking, and I think that'll do the trick. Now the way I'm approaching the frame for the bottom of the altar is a little different than what I did with the pulpit. In this case, I'm making a frame here out of 3-inch wide, 3/4 inch thick plywood. And the idea is the frame will fit in here. I'm assembling this frame using dominoes. I'll use 2 8mm by 50mm dominoes on each corner of this frame, so it'll be really stiff. And then I'm going to attach cleats on each side, and probably on the front edge as well, that can then accept screws that come through here, through the cleat into the sides, but not penetrating all the way through. And that will also be glued. So what I'm shooting for here is a very monolithic frame side front assembly there that is really solid. And then this frame can be screwed onto the base of the altar. Okay, so you can see how, push that down, how I've got the bottom frame for the altar cut and fit with bevels on the sides and the front. And I'm going to now cut another strip of plywood to go along here so I have a complete frame, and then I can finally set a piece of thinner plywood on here to make a little shelf and to conceal all this. So that's the plan. Okay, so you can see how I attached the bottom frame for the altar. I got 9 screws across the front there that go straight on into the frame. Then on each corner I have 2 screws, and that will be covered up with trim pieces. And then internal, I went ahead and put 4 screws kind of toe-nailed on each side. And of course this joint all along here is going to be glued. For the top frame on the pulpit, I'm going to go in with screws, what was that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on a side, for the side, front, the other side, as well as screws coming in from each corner up front and the corners in the back. And so to get this angle right, the screw is going to come in, I think you can see that, about like that. I need to drill the holes with a drill press setup. So that's what this is all about. I'll go ahead and I'll drill the hole for the shank, and then I'll countersink it, bring that over to the pulpit, and using a hand drill, I'll go ahead and drill the pilot hole for the threads. You can see how the hole just comes out where you won't see any threads from the bottom. So here's both the top and bottom frames in place. Of course, they're just dry fit. They're not glued in yet, but they look like they'll hold the piece together very nicely. Well, I've cut some shelves, and I veneered both sides using the same techniques you've seen in the previous videos with the vacuum bag. And now I want to veneer the edge that is going to show. But this isn't the kind of thing I can put in a vacuum bag, obviously, on this edge. So I'm using a heat-sensitive glue technique. I've just taken some Titebond 3, and I've put a thin layer on the plywood here, and I'm letting that soak in, and I put another thin layer on the strip of veneer that I'm planning to install. I'll let that soak in and dry somewhat, and then I'll put another layer on that doesn't soak in. It stays pretty much on the surface. I'll let that get fairly dry, so it's got some gloss to it, but but your fingers don't stick to it. It's not that tacky. At that point, you can lay the veneer on there and then come in with an iron and iron the veneer in place, and it stays. I did a little sample here, and that's on there really good. Okay, well, what you see in here is the bottom of the shelf that goes midway up in the altar. I guess I believe in 2 major things. First of all, very sound construction, and the inside of my pieces look as good as the outside of my pieces. And so the reason I'm showing you the bottom of this is these cleats are going to have to glue onto the bottom of the shelf. But before I glue them on, I'm going to finish the bottom of the shelf, except for this little strip where the cleats are going to glue. And that way, this will have the same, it's a shellac, thin shellac, you might call it a shellac polish finish as the rest of the piece. Also, I went ahead and I veneered the bottom as well as the top of the shelf. Now this has to do with soundness of construction. When you apply veneer to something, if you only veneer one side, and that veneer shrinks or grows with humidity, it can tend to make the substrate want to warp, cup a little bit. So I always veneer both sides, and that way the pull from the veneer is even on both sides. So my next step, oh, by the way, also I veneered the end of these cleats, and they're at the same angle as the sides, the angle of the sides. So that all ought to fit together and look nice together. Well, I've gotten about as far as I can on the frames and shelves. At this point, to proceed any farther on these, I've got to take everything apart, finish the insides, leave an unfinished place where these glue in, and then do the complete reassembly. While it's all apart, I want to put a little veneer on these surfaces that I haven't been able to veneer on account of they've been attached. This shelf down here is kind of interesting. It'll be screwed into place with some nice little brass screws, most likely, but this hides the actual frame that holds the bottom together. So once that's all attached and glued in, I'll just install that, and you won't even know there's a flange frame down there.